So what is a WBody? Well, that's a chassis designation from a series of GM cars that ran from the late 80s to around 2016 with the end of the fleet Chevy Impalas. Covers 9 models over various generations, which we'll discuss more in the video as we go. So, what makes me qualified to kind of grade these WBody cars? Well, to be honest, not much more than any other enthusiast, but anyone who's watched my channel knows I do have a 2005 Grand Prix. I've done some pretty good work on it, and I'd like to think or hope I'm at least some sort of knowledge on the cars. But it goes a little deeper than that. I also previously had a 97 Grand Prix SC, but it was with an optional 3800 engine. I had a Chevy Lumina winter beater about 10 years ago, ran that for a little while. I also had other cars that's kind of been in my family or extended family. I've had, my parents have had a Buick Century and an Oldsmobile Intrigue, which I worked on pretty extensively, as you might have mentioned. Anything repairs needs done, I'm the one doing it. I've also had extended family who've had Chevy Impalas, Buick Regals, which I've also worked on. So to that end, out of the 9 WBody cars that existed, the models anyways, I've worked on or owned 6 of them over the generations. So not bad. But this got me thinking a bit more. What's the best and which is the worst? Okay, so the big question is, how do I make a list judging 9 cars off the same kind of designation, but also remove any bias? So what I did is I came up with a list of various things that you really can't fudge around with. These are numbers directly off of various sites or anything like that. And then I based it off those numbers and kind of went from there. So to kind of give you an idea, just so you know where everything is, I looked at how many years they were available, total sales. The total price ranges to buy the car now, like what the cheapest and most expensive is, along with original MSRP. How easy they were to buy, their availability, overall user scores and reviews from a variety of sites. How many known issues there were in recalls, and also the ratio of recalls and complaints to numbers sold, which is very important. Independent testing by 4 individuals, so I actually tested the cars with 4 people just to see what they thought of it, from unbiased and from people who don't know too many of the cars. I looked at the space, I looked at engine options, horsepower, torque ratings, things like that. So it was a pretty extensive list. There could have been other considerations too, like insurance rates or MPG, things like that. But since it's just kind of a fun list, I wanted to just that's a pretty extensive list of stuff to look at right off the bat, and I didn't want to bog it down with too much more. And last, this is technically a top 10 video, but since there's only 9 cars, I'm obviously only just covering 9 cars, so I guess you can call it a top 9 video. I'm dividing the lists up for each car as what it did well, what it did bad, so anywhere that it didn't score well on the lists, and also my own take, because the numbers that may reflect there versus what I feel may be different, but I just want to give my little take on it. Also, for anyone where I list any prices, the prices are in Canadian, so I base it off of that. But other than that, I think we're ready to go, so let's get started. Number 9 on the list is the Chevy Lumina. So where did it kind of exceed? Well, it didn't score well in a lot of areas, if I may be honest, but there's some things it did very well. It is definitely one of the most affordable cars to buy on the list. It has a low starting price of just $500 Canadian, and for a really low mileage option with lots of options and stuff like that, you could be looking around $6,000, so not too bad. It's a very roomy car though, and it has one of the longest runs of any WBody car at 11 years, so that's about it though. So for the couple of areas where it did kind of do well, there's a whole other areas where it didn't. Pretty much when I did the focus groups on the looks, that car scored on the bottom of the list for everybody. A lot of people are scared away by it. It is kind of a hard car to find, and that's partially due to its age, but also due to some of the reliability and longevity issues of the car. Even with so many years on the market, there's some cars that have less years that are easier to get. Also, it had the lowest overall average horsepower and torque ratings compared to other cars on the list. And when you look at sales numbers and model number years versus recalls and issues, it had the worst recall and issue ratio list of all of them there. So with all this said and everything there's really not a lot that you can really score the car well on. Now, as mentioned before, I did own a Lumina way back as a winter beater. I owned it, I don't know, about 10 years ago. And to be honest with you, I actually liked the car. It had lots of room. It was really smooth as far as the drive. The horsepower and torque ratings that I mentioned in the did bad area did match up. It didn't have the oomph that you get some other WBody cars. But you know what? It served me well through the whole winter period that I had the car. And after that, I even sold it to someone else who used it for a couple years more, and they didn't have any problems with it either. But unfortunately, the numbers don't lie, and wherever all the statistics, the user scores, everything came in, that car just didn't hold up. Number 8 is the Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme. Well, to be honest with you, that's another car that didn't do well overall, and it was actually a pretty close fight between this car and the Lumina. However, it did do a few things a little bit better than the Lumina, and those things helped it stay out of the last place spot. It had a great variety of engines to choose from, depending on the age and the model year of the car, but crucially, the engines always seem to be evolving. Like if you look at an engine that came out and when it first launched out to that same engine later on, there's always horsepower gains, there's changes to the car, so it always seems to be evolving and moving along through the model years. It also had a low amount of recalls and complaints when compared to the other cars, both in general volume and model year to complaint ratio. So overall, it had pretty decent reliability scores, and that kind of helped it stay out of the lowest rankings. But it also didn't do well in many other areas. In the focus group, it was considered also one of the ugliest cars when even compared to the Lumina. It had pretty low horsepower and torque ratings compared to other cars. Now, mind you, this car was older, but even when you compare it to other cars in the market at the time, it also was really underpowered. So it kind of didn't hold up even as time went on. Its pricing currently is actually pretty poor compared to other cars, which I found surprising. And I'm not sure if that has to do with maybe perceived collectability due to the age of the car. Other cars don't seem to have that same price range that it had. So, I mean, I saw cars as high as $25,000 for a low mileage one. That's way too high. Now, also considering it had a pretty decent 9-year run, you'd think there'd still be more availability, even though it's an older car. But nope, finding one is very hard, and like I say, the price is kind of up there. And that may say a lot to its longevity and reliability. Like you could find an old Buick Regal, finding an Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme, not so easy. I would say that overall, this car seems to be the ugly duckling of the WBody world that no one wants or ever talks about. Well, my take on the car is, I have no take on the car, to be honest. I have no history of the car, and in fact, rarely ever encountered them. I've encountered every other car to some degree, except this one. The Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme just seemed to be off the radar. Seemed to be a pretty low seller, and people rarely saw them, and it didn't seem to really have any redeeming qualities for it in the real world. So, ultimately, this means it didn't make the cut, and it was number 8 on the list. Now, the Cutlass Supreme and the Lumina were very close in the lowest rankings. But then there's a bit of a jump, and then cars 7 to 5 are also were fighting very closely in that same score range as well. But ultimately, it came down to this. So number 7 is actually the Buick Century. And where it kind of exceeded, where did it go well? Well, it does have some really good positives, and first and foremost, it is one of the most affordable cars on the list, with a price range starting at $500 Canadian, and for a really clean, really low mileage, well optioned, you can get one for $3,900 Canadian, which is really good. It also had a surprising user score, with a lot of people seem to be very happy with the car, and a lot of owners talking favorably about it. It averages out in some areas, so there's some things where, like for example, its availability is decent, but doesn't exceed or do bad. The amount of average complaints and recalls is also kind of in the middle. Doesn't exceed, but it doesn't do bad. It's just kind of average, and that's why the car ranks at number 7. There's other than the price ranges and some of the user scores, everything else is just middle of the range. Now, the car also kind of had some areas where it didn't do well at all. First off, the looks were definitely take it or leave it, most leaving it. A lot of people find it very bland and ho-hum, and just doesn't really speak to you or call out to you in any way. It's just kind of there. It also had, now this is where it's important, where I was talking before about looking at the amount of recalls and complaints, but also looking at the model years, how many models it sold, how many units it sold, and how many years it was in run. Because although it had kind of a lower amount of complaints and recalls compared to some of the other cars, when you took into account how many production years it had, and its total sale units, it actually was the second highest on the list. So, you know, it actually wasn't as reliable as some of the numbers may have it perceived. It also got stuck with the 3.1 liter V6 for its entire 8-year run. The 3800 reserved for the Regal only, so you really didn't get the 3.1. Is not a bad engine, but it's kind of underpowered for these bigger cars, and so that's kind of what you're stuck with. It also had a very super soft, kind of very floaty suspension to ride, so it wasn't a car for handling at all, especially compared to other WBody cars. And essentially, when it came down to it, it's just a base model Regal. So my take on the car is actually wasn't that bad when we had it. I mean, it's been a long time ago. I'd say probably about 8 or 9 years ago that we had the car, and we had it for a couple of years, and we bought it used. It did its job. The floaty suspension thing is definitely there. It's not a handling car by any means. Also, the lack of power was definitely felt, so I can completely confirm these things for sure. And I can kind of see where some of the user scores were higher because, my parents were actually fairly happy with the car. But the main reason to get rid of the car was also looking at the second highest on the list for recalls and recalls versus production years, is when something went on the car, everything went all at once. Like, we had a whole bunch of stuff, the rear end went, a whole bunch of stuff went all at once, and the value of the repairs, even just looking at parts, because there's no labor, I'm doing the work myself. Versus the value of the car just didn't make sense. So ultimately, we got rid of the car for that. So up until everything went, it was fine, but then everything just went at once. Just wasn't worth keeping. Number 6 on the list is the Oldsmobile Intrigue. So where did it exceed? Well, as mentioned, cars 5, 6, and 7 are kind of average cars, but this is a very good average car, and maybe slightly underrated. First, for a car with its size and quality, it has one of the overall lowest purchase prices, coming in from anywhere in the range of $800 to $3,900. $3,900 will get you a clean model with low mileage for sure. It also has a low number of recalls and issues in volume, so the car holds up well in this regard. The looks also polarized for this car, but some people did rate it pretty high up in the list. Others did rate it a little lower. Interestingly, it had good horsepower and torque numbers from all its engine offerings. It didn't have many engine offerings, but the numbers were all good. And user ratings across various sites indicate people are pretty happy with the car. So the car does have its shortfalls, though. It does have the shortest run of any WBody car, just 4 years. So the volume of recalls and issues were low when compared to model years and sales. It's actually near the top of the worst of list. Also, due to low sales numbers and model years and its age, finding one compared to other WBodies is not an easy task at all. Also, as mentioned, the looks were very polarizing, and while some people did like it, others did consider it very bland and maybe even a little ugly. So, everything else, anything that's not mentioned between the good and the bad, are just average stuff. Like, everything else just kind of didn't exceed, didn't do bad. It's just meh. So, that's kind of where the car stands. Okay, on my take of this car, well, I'll be honest with you, if it wasn't for the numbers, I would be biased to this car and actually would rate higher just from personal experience. Like I said, my parents had the car, and it was, quite frankly, it was pretty awesome. It was very smooth. The Short Star 3.5 liter V6 is the engine we had great power, drove really well, was really good on gas, and the car was pretty loaded. And maybe most importantly, it protected my sister, who was driving it at the time, from a catastrophic accident where a taxi ran her red and T-boned her. The car was hit really hard. It was written off. The door panels was knocked in so hard it actually jammed against the seat. But it kept her safe and completely injury-free. No problems at all. So based just on our experiences of having the car, we probably may even have the car today. Who knows? And just based on those experiences alone, I would actually have rated the car higher. But once again, the numbers have to speak for itself, and that's why it's rated number 6. Now, number 5 is the Buick Regal. And this should probably come as no surprise considering the Century was number 7. And as some of you may know, the Regal is essentially more or less an upscale Buick Century. So that's why it kind of scored closer, but obviously it did exceed because it does do better in many areas. It is worth noting, though, as far as average cars go, the Regal is the king. It scored in average rankings more than any other cars, so it does many things at least average or well enough. It does not fail particularly in the area, but it doesn't overly impress either. There is some impressive areas though. There's some areas that it did exceed a little more in. It had the second longest WBody run at 16 years overall. It has a good amount of availability. Seems to be pretty easy to find a car if you're looking for one. Its price ranges are well within available and affordability ranges, even for a top spec low mileage option. And user scores are among the top of any of the cars on this list. That's about where it ends in its overachiever status, though. It does some things decently well, though. Based on how many recalls and issues there were versus sales and model years, it's actually right in the middle. So that's also on the recalls and also sales and model years versus recalls. Its looks are considered average by the focus group, and interestingly, although the Regal and the Century do look very similar, the Regal always definitely scored higher, even without telling people the difference in the cars. It had access to a variety of WBody engines, had good horsepower and torque ratings, and kind of hold itself well through the model years. Well, I also mentioned it's average in other areas too of the scoring chart, so there are some areas that didn't hold up as well. The biggest issue was the volume of recalls and issues. So although when compared to the total run it had, which was the 16 years, which its average recall issue per car sold and per model year is average. But if you just look at the full volume of issues and recalls, it's on the tops, with the most recalls and issues amongst any of the WBody cars. So if you buy one, you probably can expect some sort of issue. And speaking of buying, I did mention it had decent availability, but barely. Considering how many were sold and for how long, finding one is definitely possible, but finding a decent one in good condition is not quite as easy. Finding one you can do, but and they do have some good top spec models with decent pricing, but not as easy as it would seem. And as alluded to above, everything from the focus group to the looks to many other specs, it's just kind of a average, maybe sort of blandish car. Well, here's my take on the car. I had a cousin who had the car, and she did actually like it initially. But as time went on, more issues reared its head, from fuel economy issues to electrical issues to all sorts of other stuff. It seemed to line up with the amount of overall issues that were reported. And if this gives you any indication of where this car went, it scared her enough to make her go to a PT Cruiser. And I think that's enough said. Okay, so that's it. Number 5 there with the Buick Regal, we kind of end off with the lower scoring average cars. These last 4 now scored in the tops of the list, and they actually were all very, very close. So this is now the best of the WBody cars. So number 4 on the list is the Buick Lacrosse, also known as the Allure in Canada. At least it was known as the Allure during this generation only. It had a fairly small run of 4 years, just slightly longer than the Intrigue, before it was completely redesigned into its current generation. But in that, it definitely left a mark. Even with its small run, it sold enough to make it one of the most easily purchased cars on the list, with actually pretty decently average pricing. But considering the driver-friendly features for the car that you get, the pricing is understandable. It was a fairly loaded car. And even though it only had 3 engine choices in the 4 years, you can either get the 3800 V6, which, a lot of us know and love. There's the 3.6 liter V6, which is good, or a 5.3 liter V8 in the Ultra. So not bad at all. Secondly, knowing Buick's reputation, it does amaze me how high the looks scored with the focus groups. A lot of people actually, at least during that time, still put Buicks down a bit, but it actually did pretty well. A lot of people liked the looks of the car. And in fact, it was near the top of the lists. And last, it had the lowest number of recalls and issues amongst all the cars, factoring both sales and total recall volume. Now, it doesn't do too many things wrong, to be honest. The looks, while still scoring pretty well, were still considered slightly bland to some. Decent, a decent looker, but also not over the top. User scores are actually surprisingly lower for this car than it was for other cars, when you look at just the average scores. So people didn't seem to be as happy with the car as the other numbers would indicate. And although it's decently priced at around $1,000 to $10,800 Canadian, with obviously the $10,800 for a low mileage, well spec'd model. It's definitely not the most affordable of the bunch. So, take all this into account. For my take, well, not much I could say about the car. I don't really have a lot of experience with it. I have experience actually with the newer ones, but this generation here, which is the WBody one, really didn't have much experience with it, so we're just going to base it off the numbers, and that should all speak for itself. Number 3 on the list is the Chevy Impala. And it's interesting. Among many people, the Impala did not have a stellar reputation, but honestly, the numbers say otherwise. With the second longest run of any of all the WBody cars, with 13 years in standard production, plus an additional 3 years in fleet production, going from 2013 to 2016. It also had a host of other options and trims to choose from, and in fact, it had the most available purchasable options of any car on this list. It had a fairly high number of recalls and complaints, sure, but when you compare it to the total volume sales in the model years that it was in production, it actually has one of the best ratios of all the cars on the list. Some people actually also, when I talked earlier, not including this video here, did complain about the looks, but actually when I ran the focus group, a lot of people actually weren't as polarized, and it scored pretty high on everyone's list. So overall, I mean, where it counts, the car holds up well. And really, there's not a whole lot to complain about either. It has an average amount of recalls by total volume, but I believe this is negated by the fact that when you look at the total sales, that actual number of recalls is actually quite low when you look at sales and actually the model years it was in production. It also has a higher average price than other cars, which are the range of $450 in the low end to $16,000 in the high end. But that's also, logically, it's a little bit misleading because the Impala was in production longer than any of the cars into the current years. I mean, the last cars that really were in production on the WBody scale was the Lacrosse and the Grand Prix, which went out in production in 2009 and 2008 respectively. But as I mentioned before, the Impala went all the way through to 2013 as a standard car before the new model went out, but it continued for another 3 years as a fleet car. So they're newer model cars, so expect the price to be a bit higher. The only other significant complaint I really see is that owners and user reviews do score a little bit lower than other cars. So while the numbers actually do look good, it seems the owners are saying otherwise. So for my take, I think I'm going to side more with the positives than the negatives here. I've had actually numerous people in my extended family, so I'm talking aunts, uncles, cousins, etc., who actually owned these cars in various years, from the early 2000s to the last generation. And the impressions were either, it does its job, or it's awesome and I love it. So it seems like, at the very least, there's never this car sucks. It's like, it does what it needs to do, or I love the car. They are workhorses, and it may not impress in some areas, but everyone I know who's ever owned one stands by them. I think that says a lot. Number 2 on the list is the Chevy Monte Carlo. And, the Monte Carlo has an interesting history. It first started out as a Lumina coupe, essentially, which is number 9 on the list, funny enough. But then it became essentially an Impala coupe when the generation changed over, and the Impala was obviously number 3. But the Monte Carlo somehow just knocks it out of the park, just completely levels off everywhere else. It had a decent production run. It has surprisingly good availability. It has one of the best overall user scores of any car on the list. It has low number of recalls and issues, either by total volume, by car sales, by model years, doesn't matter. It was really good on the recall and issues scale. It scored really high in the looks department, with this fighting with the number 1 car for the top spot. It had fantastic engine options and power to go with it. And honestly, what is there not to love with this car? It's actually kind of hard to find a complaint with it. And if there's probably only one, and that's its price. At the time of filming, prices ranges from $1,100 on the low end scale for $23,000 on the top end. And that's a lot for a 12-year-old Chevy. You can argue that it holds its value really well, but I also argue that you can value a car at anything you want, but will people buy it? Besides that, though, and the higher price tag, honestly, I have nothing else to report. It either was above average or tops on everything else on the list. With the Monte Carlo, I don't have anyone in my family, and I've never owned one myself. I have driven them, but I've known a lot of people who do have them, like friends and so on, and they would swear by them, and I can honestly see why. I can't blame them, honestly. Can you? They're fantastic cars. The car does so many things right that it seems to be worth having. And while I can't speak from personal experience, I think the numbers and the experiences I know from other people just says it all. And number 1 is the Pontiac Grand Prix. Just like the Monte Carlo, it has a lot to love and not much to complain about. In fact, the Monte Carlo and the Grand Prix were pretty neck and neck in some areas. It has the longest production run of any WBody on the car at 20 years, believe it or not. And this has made finding one with any of your needs, what you're looking for, very easy. There's no shortage in finding Grand Prix. Whatever power ratings you're looking for, whatever engines, whether you're looking for smaller V6s in early models, you're looking for a big block a small block V, 5.3 liter V8 in the GXP, to all versions of the 3800 series engine, it has it all. It has more engine options over its entire run versus any other car. Its price ranges are very affordable, going from $500 just around $10,000 for a fully loaded GXP with low mileage. It's scored in the top ranks for user scores. It has very low recalls and issues by model years and sale numbers. The looks scored near the top, and most people picked it as their number one car. I mean, it was close to Monte Carlo, but the Grand Prix seemed to score out most. I mean, just about any area you could think of, it actually exceeded. And honestly, the only real complaint I could really come up with is when you look at the total volume of recalls and complaints. It actually was pretty high when you look at volume, which is, again, just a total, not taking into account how many units were sold and how many model years was in production. It was actually near the top of the list. I think it was 6th or 7th overall. But then again, when you factor in how many units were sold and the total model years, again 20 years, that ratio is actually really low, and it kind of reverses number, actually showing that for the amount of units that are out there, you're actually not going to have a lot of issues. And I think that says a lot. I mean, there's a couple things that go wrong with the car, but overall it did really well, and I think it was overall second when you look at total sales and model years versus complaints. All right, here's my take. I want to promise you, first and foremost, even as a Grand Prix owner, this list is not biased. I tried to not make it biased in any way by taking hard numbers, right? You can't fudge the numbers. With that, I have no influence over it. The numbers were the numbers, and I just hope that my car would come up front, because I'll be honest, I am biased toward it. Of course, I would want the Grand Prix to win. So that said, I'm glad that it made the top and it was number one. As you mentioned before, I had a 97 earlier and my 05 now, and I really wanted these cars to be the top, so I'm happy that it made the list. After running the numbers, I'm happy with the results. And I'm happy that it reflects that this car that I love so much is, in my opinion, the top WBody. All right, so that's it. First, I want to remind you guys, don't forget to like and subscribe, comment, let me know if you agree with the list, disagree with the list. Everyone's going to have their own opinions. This is just my opinions. I put through some numbers in there, and that's why I also gave my take, because my take may differ. But you know what? I think it was a fun project to work on this one as well. So what is your take? And let me know what you think, and we'll go from there. I thank you very much for watching the video, and you take care. Bye-bye.